In this video, we're going to talk about two types of variables in Java. The first being primitive variables, which would be your int, float, char types, and object reference variables, which would be string variables or variables for objects that you create yourself. This is an important topic in Java because the difference between primitives and object references is something that can cause issues when you start working with things like collections. So primitive variables just get stored in memory. So when I declare an int x, like I'm doing here, that allocates some location in memory for us to store the value 10. With doubles, it's very similar. When we declare a double, it allocates some memory for us to store that double in, and then when we use the name x or pi in our code, Java knows where to find that. Now, object reference variables in a lot of ways are the same. So if I declare a string variable, I get not the value of the string in memory, I get a reference to a string object. The same thing here, when I create a new thing with the number 42 in the string Grogu, in that case, I don't get that 42 in Grogu in this particular memory location. I get a reference to the object. So it actually looks like this, where this is a reference to somewhere else in memory where the actual object is stored. Now, one thing about strings is that they're a special type of object in that I don't have to actually instantiate it explicitly. When I give it this string literal, it knows to create an object from that. Whereas with the thing object, I have to actually explicitly call new to instantiate the object. So this is what that looks like in memory. We have all the declarations we have before. Up here, we have our variables. We have the two primitives, which store actual values in them. And then we have the two reference variables that store references to objects that are allocated elsewhere in memory. So my string, you can see, is allocated down here, and my thing is allocated right here. And it looks like we misspelled Grogu. So that should be a U. And the point of this video isn't to talk about wrapper classes. There's another video on that if you're interested, but I do want to at least mention that in Java, every primitive type has a corresponding wrapper class that is an actual object. So here we have a primitive integer that stores 10 in the variable. Here we have a integer object, so our variable just stores a reference to the actual object, which is stored elsewhere in memory. So I've created a class called object references. That's going to be the class we're demonstrating here. And I've created a private static class inside of object references. That's because I didn't want to go to the trouble of creating a separate file for this. It's just a real simple class, and there's not really a whole lot here. So this class has two attributes, an int num and a string name. I have a constructor that lets me initialize the object with the string and the name. I have a setter for the num. I'm not going to use getters at all, and I'm not going to use a setter for the name. This is just so I can do some stuff later on. So that's the only actual method. And then I purposely didn't do a toString here, and I'll show you why in a moment, but I do have a print command, and that print command prints out the value of the actual object. That's where we're starting. And in our main class, we'll start off declaring some primitive variables. So we'll do x is equal to 10, and a double pi is equal to 3.14159. And I misspelled primitive. And now let's create some object reference variables. So I'll create a new string object, a new thing object, and this thing object I'll initialize with 42 and Grogu. And I'm getting an error message here, which I'm kind of surprised is. That should be thing. I'll create another thing that I'll initialize with 4 and privet. And I'll do one more thing, which I will initialize with 2020, but that needs to be a number, and the string Arizona. So let me start off by printing everything out. So now that I'm printing everything out, let's go ahead and run the code and see what happens. And I get my primitive variables, I get my string, but notice I get this weird stuff with my object reference variables. Now, this should look familiar because something similar to this is what we saw in the slides. So here we see that thing holds some reference that looks like this, and the actual data is somewhere else. If I want to show the actual data of these values, then I need to write a toString method, and then when I do the string append here, it gets treated like a string. Now, the reason that the object reference variable for our string actually prints the value there, and that's because string has a built-in toString method that does what you would expect. So we'll print out our things using the print method, and now you can see they have the values that we would expect. So one thing that makes object reference variables sort of difficult to do things with, if we say ANTHR is equal to TNG, let's take these two values and print them. So here you see they both have the same values. So that's pretty good. That's what we would expect. So now, actually, let's also print that we're saying after ANTHR equals TNG. So now let's say we're going to set another's number to 123. And let's run now. And you'll see, perhaps unexpectedly, that both of these changed. TNG changed as well as another thing. And the reason for that is, if we go back up here in our code and grab these print statements, you can see that TNG and another now both are referring to the same thing. Their actual value is the same. Up here, another was 17A7CEC2, but after the assignment, it became the same as TNG. So it's important to keep in mind that when you're working with object variables such as these, you're actually working with reference variables, not with the objects themselves. So when you do things like this, you're saying, I want this reference to refer to the same object that this one is referring to. So that does lead to some confusion, and we'll actually point out some of those along the way throughout the semester. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of how primitive variables and object reference variables are related, but also quite different.